What is fantasy even for? Why do we read fantasy books? And before I get into the actual books that I want to talk about today, there's a bigger question here to think about. Is fantasy meant to help us escape reality? Is it meant to hold a mirror up to us? Some fantasy leans more towards myth and wonder. It lets us explore amazing imaginary worlds. That's one of the appeals. That's, detached from our own. Other fantasy leans more towards realism. It uses magical worlds. It explores political and social systems that we find interesting compared to our own. Both of these approaches can work, but they produce very different reading experiences. And that difference is exactly what you see when you compare Babel and Blood over Brighthaven. The greatest strength of this novel is its protagonist, Robin Swift. Robin is a really compelling character because he exists at the center of really powerful tensions. He's torn between ideology and loyalty, between nationalism and his own personal identity, between the system that educated him and the system that exploits him. These two paradigms are going on. Watching Robin navigate those competing pressures is easily the most engaging part of the book. That's why I enjoyed it the most. The dynamic between Robin and the other main characters, Rami, Letty, and Victoire, are also really excellent, that group of characters. Their friendships create a human center within the story that's otherwise very concerned with larger political themes. And the setting is awesome. It's fantastic. Oxford in the height of the British Empire provides a really good backdrop for exploring questions of imperialism and nationalism and racism and class hierarchy and all those things that make the book so good. The historical context allows the book to critique the power structures of that era while also it indirectly comments on modern ones that we see today. Babel is an extremely timely novel, but the book, for me, also has significant problems. The first is that it is incredibly pedantic. The entire speculative element of the story revolves around magical silver bars, which are powered by differences between translated words across languages. Because the magic system depends on linguistic theory, the book spends a tremendous amount of time explaining these differences in how language works. And those explanations, linguistic explanations, can get a little exhausting. They did for me. Large portions of the book involve the characters marveling at linguistic nuance while the narration tries to guide the reader into sharing that fascination. It's interesting at first, but it eventually becomes very overwrought. The second issue I had with the book is the world building felt contrived. Rather than feeling like an organic world that happens to contain these characters, the setting often feels engineered specifically to place these characters into ideological conflict. You can almost feel the author behind the scenes orchestrating the events. And then my third issue with the book is it's extremely heavy-handed. One of the central dynamics involves two competing approaches to revolution, one represented by violent resistance and the other by gradual reform. The conflict is genuinely interesting and really historically important, but the book presents these ideas with very little subtlety. Characters often feel like they are serving as mouthpieces for the novel's broader political arguments rather than emerging naturally from the world itself. And once the trajectory of the story becomes clear, the ending begins to feel kind of inevitable, like a little bit of a slog for me. None of this makes Babel a bad book. I did actually enjoy it, but it's a book where the themes often overpower the storytelling. Now, I want to compare that book to Blood over Brighthaven. In many ways, this book explores very similar themes, like colonialism, class hierarchy, sexism, nationalism, immigrant exploitation, all those things. But it handles them quite differently. The characters here are exceptional. Siona, the first woman to reach the highest ranks of magical scholarship in her society, is a really fascinating protagonist. She's ambitious and brilliant and deeply driven by desire for power. She's also morally conflicted. Her relationship with Tommel, a janitor from an exploited refugee underclass, becomes the emotional heart of the story. Through Tommel and his people, the novel reveals the hidden cost of the magical system that sustains the society of Tiran. The history of the oppressed Kuang refugees is really the central story of the book, and it's told very effectively. And like Babel, the story is told very effectively. It tackles the same themes like imperialism and bigotry and nationalism and class conflict, authoritarian power structures, all of those things. The key difference is how those themes interact with the fantasy setting. The book isn't really escapist fantasy, it's fantasy realism. Instead of offering an escape from the real world problems, it recreates those problems in a fantastical setting and forces the reader to confront them. That's why it's realism. And the book that makes the book a somewhat uncomfortable reading experience. But that discomfort is intentional. The story isn't trying to pacify the reader like escapism. It's trying to challenge the reader. My main criticism of this book is that the plot can feel slightly contrived. Siona's internal moral struggle sometimes fall into like a binary structure, I thought. She begins as this cold, ambitious figure, but gradually discovers the horrifying truth behind her society. Her compassion, which is partly genuine, but also partly tied to her own ego and ambition, that creates a nice tension in the narrative. But because the moral arc of her character becomes relatively predictable, the eventual resolution of the story feels somewhat inevitable and predictable as well. And then the villains can also be quite blunt. But in an interesting way, the bluntness of the villains actually reflects the realism the book is trying to portray. Real evil, everyday evil, is often banal and obvious, and the story reflects that. So when you step back and look at these two books together, something interesting emerges. Both novels attempt to use fantasy to explore real world systems of power and oppression, but they do so in slightly different ways. Babel leans heavily into the ideological arguments. The fantasy elements sometimes feel secondary to the themes the author wants to explore. In Blood Over Brighthaven, it feels more grounded in its characters and their experiences within the world. Both books can feel heavy-handed at times, but Blood Over Brighthaven ultimately felt more organic and less pedantic to me. And because of that, it ends up being, in my opinion, the much stronger novel. But the most interesting thing about both books is what they say about the evolution of fantasy. Fantasy used to be primarily about myth and escapism. Today, many fantasy authors are using the genre to examine real political and social systems. In other words, fantasy is becoming less about escaping reality and more about understanding our current day reality that we live in. And that raises an interesting question. When we read fantasy, what are we really looking for? Do we want to leave the world behind for a while? Or do we want stories that help us see the world more clearly through a realistic lens? Because both books, these books, Babel and Blood Over Brighthaven, suggest that modern fantasy might be doing a little bit of both. And I definitely am seeking both those things from my fantasy reads. I'm Wick Welliker. Thanks for watching my video. Please subscribe if you enjoy my content, my thoughts. I'm also an author. You can take a look at my work. I write science fiction and science fantasy. You can take a look at my website. You can sign up for my newsletter, get some free stuff, and check out the things that I've done. No pressure. And then I do a podcast as well, a medical podcast. I'm a medical doctor. I do a podcast about intensive care and anesthesiology. And I also talk a lot about books on my podcast. So if you've enjoyed this kind of in-depth stuff, I talk about it a lot on my podcast. It's on my YouTube, and it's just wherever you listen to podcasts. So please subscribe, and thank you for joining me.